Today, below the budget blizzard. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and product news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, I have to say last week's media coverage of the budget, though it was wall-to-wall, was at least sycophantic, and it was deceptive. Take the Tele's working class plan headline. The coverage missed the point, and in fact the short-term cash splash, aka bribe, will soon be totally consumed and people will generally be worse off. And as I outlined in my earlier post when I analysed the budget, there was nothing here strategic at all. It was all about buying votes for the next election. But there were a couple of high points in the online media when we actually did get to the heart of the story. This, for example, from Alan Kohler in the New Daily, focusing on the strategic errors that were made in 2020, thus creating a higher than needed debt burden for the country. He said, the overriding factor of federal government finances in 2022 and everything about Tuesday night's budget is that Treasury got the pandemic entirely wrong. It's perhaps hard to blame the spreadsheet jockeys too much. No one was alive during the previous pandemic, and in the depths of the 2020 panic, forecasts about what this might do to the economy and government income and expenses were a complete guess. But let it be recorded and not forgotten that Treasury and therefore the Treasurer guessed wrong, with the result that they overcompensated and underforecast by a lot. Specifically, the $350 billion in government spending and $350 billion in entirely coincidental Reserve Bank buying government debt was more than double what was required. So $250 billion of it was saved by grateful, bemused households. As a result, Treasury's economic forecasts were out by miles. In the budget brought down in the grimness of October 2020, Treasury said GDP would shrink by 1.5% in 2021. In fact, it grew by 1.5% in that year, a 3% turnaround. In October 2020, the forecast for unemployment in 2021 was 7.5%. It turned out to be 5.1%. It's hard to overstate the impact on the budget bottom line of such huge misses in GDP and unemployment. Treasury never gets these things exactly right, of course, but it's never that far out. So in the October 2020 budget, the estimate of the deficit for that financial year 2021 was $213.7 billion, but it turned out to be $134.2 billion. And the current financial year has a month to go, but the deficit is projected to $79.8 billion versus the $112 billion that was forecast in 2020. So across the 2 years of the pandemic, Treasury's early estimates of budget deficits were out by a total of $111.7 billion, or 30%. And for a government trying to get re-elected, there is nothing more beautiful than forecasts that were way too gloomy in the forgotten, chaotic and forgiven past. So across the past 3 budget statements over the past 12 months, that is, last year's budget in May, the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook in December, and the latest 22-23 budget, the parameter variations, that is, things resulting from better than expected economic outcomes, totaled $283.5 billion over the 4-year forward estimates. Of that, $162.9 billion has been or will be spent, including $30.4 billion in this budget, out of parameter variations of $114.6 billion. It looks positively parsimonious. The Treasurer Josh Frydenberg is spending less than 30% of his windfall gain. He's able to sprinkle a 50% cut in petrol excise for 6 months, a $420 tax offset for 10 million people, $250 cash payments to another 6 million deserving voters, $500 million for local councils, $880 million for wavering regional electorates, and lots more, whilst also shrinking the deficit. What a guy. And remember that $16 billion in decisions taken but not yet announced in last year's MYEFO, where everyone remarked then that this was obviously a hollow log full of cash to buy votes for the election. Well, now it's disappeared, or rather announced maybe although there's no record of that, just $25 billion of new payment measures over 4 years. And as for decisions taken but not yet announced in this budget, they amount to 1.5 billion reductions in payments across the 4-year estimates, although for 22-23 alone, it's an extra $1.44 billion in unrevealed new spending decisions, presumably to be revealed during the campaign. Likewise, on the receipt side of the ledger, decisions taken but not yet announced amount to $2 billion increase in tax revenue, although that is blown out of the water by the $6.7 billion cut in petrol excise and the cost of living tax offset for 22-23. But that more or less sums up Josh Frydenberg's fourth budget. Spending this year, austerity later. But not yet announced, of course. And that might upset someone. Meanwhile, the budget bottom line continues to improve into the distant future versus the two gloomy predictions of 2020, that is, but not, of course, versus predictions in Josh Frydenberg's first budget in just 2019. That shining icon of optimism brought down on April the 2nd, 2019, a month and a half before what was to be a triumphant election, forecast $38 billion of budget surpluses between 2020 and 2023. And that's now turned out to be deficits of $292 billion over the same 3 years. Hang on, urges the Treasurer. It was a different world then, which is true. Let's instead compare those deficits with forecasts in the 2020 budget, which totaled $413.5 billion from 2020 to 2023. What an improvement, yes. But everything in that 2020 budget was wrong, as the red faces of Treasury officials standing in the background, staring at the floor. A test. And also this from Michael West Media by Callum Foote, arguing that Frydenberg hid $30 a week tax increases for most Australians. Treasurer Frydenberg announced a number of cost of living measures in his budget speech. Those included a one-off $250 cost of living tax offset for more than 10 million low and middle income earners, a boost to people receiving the low and middle income tax offset by $420 for the 21-22 financial year, as well as halving the fuel excise for 6 months. What the Treasurer didn't say is that the additional $420 tax offset for low and middle income earners he mentioned will stop entirely at the end of this financial year on June 30th. The extra cash bumps the tax offset up to $1,500 this year, which ends on June the 30th. This means that despite the extra cash given to them this year, those on this tax offset will be $1,500 or almost $30 a week worse off. The cut to the fuel excise will be 22 cents per litre, a welcome but temporary reprieve, though industry bodies have calculated that the average cost per litre has actually risen by 38 cents since the Ukrainian invasion. On top of the cost of fuel and vanishing tax offsets, Australians are looking down the barrel of a superannuation contribution increase which is likely to come out of their take-home pay, and mortgage interest rates which are likely to be raised and will increase the cost of living for the majority of Australians. Adding up all these costs, the typical full-time working Australian on $85,000 a year will be an estimated $50 a week worse off after tax, with this budget only relieving this burden by $20.80 per week. Combined with the very low levels of wage growth workers have experienced in recent years, and with the December quarter seeing it at just 0.7%, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, this budget fails to keep Australians afloat. Now here's a breakdown of the major problems which are coming to take money off the kitchen table. LAMITO, or LAMITO, is an acronym that will make most voters' eyes glaze over, but when it runs out in 3 months, it'll mean $30 a week less on the kitchen table. The low and middle income tax offset, LAMITO, means that people who earn between $23,000 and $126,000 pay up to $1,080 less tax, or, to put another way, they get $20 per week cash in hand. This has now been boosted to $1,500, or almost $30 a week. The problem is that this is set to run out at the end of this financial year, June the 30th. By not extending the LAMITO for another year, as they did in the last budget, the government has failed to find a way to plug this hole in the weekly household budget. Something that Australians will realise come July 1, when they find themselves $30 a week worse off. The second grab is super increases coming out of wages. Unfortunately, vanishing tax cuts aren't the only difficulty facing Australians. The amount that bosses will need to contribute to their workers' super will increase from 10% to 10.5% at the start of the next financial year, just as the tax benefit stops. While this may sound good for those mindful of saving for retirement, the increase is likely to come out of take-home wages. The Gradden Institute has found that workers overwhelmingly pay for increases in compulsory superannuation contributions through lower wages, with roughly 80% of the cost of super increased being passed on to employees through lower pay. For those on median income, take another $8 off the kitchen table every week. So now you're at $28 worse off. And next, it's not over yet, the Reserve Bank has made it clear that those with a mortgage need to get ready for rising rates. Some say it will start as early as June when the RBA meets. This will hit almost all Australians through higher mortgage interests, which will in turn hit those renting. This rise will most likely be by 0.25%, which equates to around $29 a week on the average Australian mortgage of $600,000. For those on the median income, take another $21 off the kitchen table every week. So now you're at $49 worse off. And then, of course, last but not least, the cost of fuel has soared since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Australian Institute of Petroleum says there's been a 38-cent per litre increase, making petrol $19 more expensive on 50 litres of fuel per week. Frydenberg's temporary 22 cents per litre fuel excise cut will alleviate most of this, leaving petrol prices just $8 higher since the invasion. The final figure for the cost that Australians are seeing in their everyday lives is staggering. A moderate estimate based on ending tax offsets, rising interest rates, increased superannuation contributions and higher fuel prices shows that those earning the typical full-time worker's salary of $85,000 will be $62 worse off each week in the new financial year, even with this budget's cost of living measures. The green line on the accompanying chart shows the likely hit to your family budget straight off the kitchen table. It's no longer there to pay this month's credit card. But of course, I would make the point that this is the other side of the election. So all of the noise about what's going to happen in the next 2 months or so is all about trying to win the election. But of course, next tax year means we're going to be worse off. Well, what did you expect from this government? They've got a track record, of course, and continue to play the same old game. But kudos to both Kohler and to Michael West for actually calling out the truth. We need a lot more of this. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.